You're too old to be gallivanting around Europe, Eleanor. Stay home where you belong. Those words for my daughter-in-law cut deeper than any knife. But what I discovered while she thought I was safely tucked away changed everything. The postcards I sent her from Paris were just the beginning of her nightmare. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Stay until the end to see how this unfolds. And please comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story reaches. I never imagined that at 70 years old, I'd be told I was too old to live my life. But standing in my son's living room that Tuesday afternoon in late September, watching my daughter-in-law Vivienne smirk at me like I was a confused child who'd wandered into the wrong house, I realized my own family had decided my expiration date had already passed. The dream of Paris had lived inside me for exactly 52 years. I can pinpoint the exact moment it was born. I was 18 years old, sitting in a darkened movie theater in my hometown of Millbrook Springs, watching Audrey Hepburn glide through the streets of Paris in a film my best friend Sandra had dragged me to see. The way the light hit the Seine River, the elegant architecture, the cafe culture where people sat for hours just watching life pass by. It all captivated me in a way nothing else ever had. Someday, I'd whispered to Sandra in the darkness, I'm going to see that city with my own eyes. Sandra had squeezed my hand and whispered back, "We'll go together when we're old and gray and don't care what anyone thinks." But life, as it tends to do, had other plans. 6 months after that movie, I met Thomas Whitmore at a church social. He was handsome, in a quiet, dependable way, with steady hands that worked construction and kind eyes that saw me, really saw me in a way that made my teenage heart flutter. We were married within a year, and Paris became something I'd get to someday. Then, our son Julian was born when I was 24, and someday got pushed further into the future. Thomas worked long hours to provide for us, and I stayed home with Julian, stretching every dollar until it screamed. We were happy, truly happy, in our modest 3-bedroom house on Maple Street. Paris became something I'd think about late at night when everyone was asleep, a secret dream I kept polished in my heart like a precious stone. When Julian turned 10, Thomas surprised me with a savings account. "For Paris," he'd said with that gentle smile of his, "put something in whenever you can, even if it's just a few dollars. We'll get you there, Ellie, I promise." But then, Thomas was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's at 54. The disease moved slowly at first, then faster, stealing his coordination, his independence, eventually his ability to work. I became his caregiver while working part-time at the Millbrook Springs Public Library to keep our health insurance active. The Paris Fund got raided for medical expenses, co-pays, the wheelchair ramp we needed to install, the special bed that would keep him comfortable. I never resented it, not once. Thomas was my love, my partner, my best friend. Caring for him was an honor, even on the hardest days when he couldn't remember my name or when his body betrayed us in ways that embarrassed us both. He passed away 7 years ago, on a quiet Tuesday morning in April. His last words to me were, "Go to Paris, Ellie. Promise me. Don't wait anymore." I'd promised, tears streaming down my face as I held his hand. But grief has a way of paralyzing you. For the first year, I couldn't think about Paris without thinking about Thomas, about how we'd planned to go together someday. The dream felt tainted by loss, like I'd be betraying him by going alone. Then Julian, who'd been supportive and present during Thomas's illness, met Vivienne Ashford at a medical conference in Chicago. She was a pharmaceutical sales representative, beautiful, polished, confident in a way that seemed almost aggressive. She was 15 years younger than Julian, and from the moment she entered our lives, she made it clear that she came from a different world than the Whitmores of Millbrook Springs. They married quickly, within 8 months of meeting, and suddenly Julian seemed different. More distant, more concerned with appearances and status, more willing to defer to Vivienne's opinions on everything from where they should live to how they should spend their time. Vivienne had convinced Julian to move from his comfortable but modest townhouse to a sprawling contemporary home in Ridgemont Estates, the wealthy enclave on the north side of town where doctors and lawyers and business executives lived behind tall fences and manicured lawns. The mortgage was substantial, but Vivienne insisted they needed to present the right image for Julian's medical practice. I tried to be welcoming to Vivienne, I really had. I'd invited her to lunch, offered to share family recipes, attempted to include her in the quilting circle I'd been a part of for 30 years. But she'd made it clear, in 1,000 small ways, that she found my life quaint and somewhat embarrassing. My small apartment above the bakery on Main Street was charming in a rustic way. My handmade clothes were very crafty. My volunteer work at the library was sweet that you keep busy. Everything about me seemed to amuse or mildly horrify her. But I'd bitten my tongue because Julian seemed happy, and what mother doesn't want her son to be happy, even if his happiness meant I saw less of him, heard from him only in brief phone calls where Vivienne's voice could often be heard in the background, coordinating his schedule down to the minute.
It was 2 years after Thomas's death when I finally started saving again for Paris. Not with grand ambitions this time, but steadily, methodically. I sold my quilts at the monthly craft market in Millbrook Springs. Each quilt took me about 6 weeks to complete, working a few hours each evening after my library shifts. I sold them for $200 each, far less than they were worth in terms of labor, but enough that over time, the money accumulated. I picked up extra hours at the library, working Saturday mornings when the children's reading hour happened. I loved those mornings, sitting in the big storytelling chair with a dozen kids gathered at my feet, their faces rapt as I read tales of adventure and magic and faraway places. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, would slip me an extra $20 some weeks, claiming there was room in the budget, even though I suspected she was adding it from her own pocket. I stopped buying new clothes and learned to make do with what I had. I cooked simple meals and froze leftovers. I canceled my cable subscription and got by with library books and the radio. Every unnecessary expense was eliminated. Every dollar saved was a step closer to Paris. My friend Sandra, who'd shared that dream with me 52 years ago, cheered me on even as her own health declined. She'd been diagnosed with breast cancer 3 years earlier, fought it hard, but the disease had returned with a vengeance. During her final weeks in hospice, she'd made me promise something. "Don't weet, Ellie," she'd said, her voice weak but fierce. "Don't let life steal this from you again. Go to Paris. Have a café au lait at a sidewalk cafe for me. Stand at the top of the Eiffel Tower and feel alive. Promise me." I'd promised her, just as I'd promised Thomas. Sandra passed on a rainy November morning, and at her funeral, I'd stood by her casket and renewed my vow silently. I would go to Paris. For Thomas, for Sandra, for the 18-year-old girl who'd sat in a dark theater and dared to dream. It took me 5 years of careful, relentless saving. 5 years of quilts and extra library hours and choosing generic brands at the grocery store. 5 years of watching my son drift further into Vivienne's orbit while I built my dream dollar by dollar. Finally, last month, I'd done it. I had $8,000 in my Paris fund. I'd researched extensively, not just grabbed the first tour I'd seen, but spent months comparing companies, reading reviews, checking credentials. I'd chosen Heritage European Tours, a company specializing in senior travel with excellent safety records and rave reviews from travelers in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. The tour was 2 weeks long, covering all the highlights I'd dreamed about. The Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, Notre Dame Cathedral, even if it was still under reconstruction, Versailles, the Latin Quarter, Montmartre. Small group size, only 12 travelers, accommodations in modest but clean 3-star hotels in safe neighborhoods, all transportation arranged, a tour director who spoke both English and French, travel insurance included. It was perfect. It was safe. It was finally happening. I'd booked it on a Monday morning in September, sitting at my kitchen table with my hands trembling so badly I could barely type my credit card information. When the confirmation email arrived, I actually cried. Tears of joy and disbelief and grief for all the people who wouldn't see me achieve this dream. I'd printed the confirmation and put it in a folder I'd labeled Paris, March 15th, 3 months away. 90 days until I'd board a plane and cross an ocean and walk streets I'd only seen in pictures. I wanted to share my joy with someone. My quilting circle friends had been wonderful, celebrating with me over tea and cookies, but I wanted my family to know. I wanted my son to know. Despite everything, despite the distance that had grown between us, I wanted Julian to be proud of me, to see that his mother was still capable of dreams and adventures. So that Tuesday afternoon, I dressed in my best slacks and the cardigan Julian had given me for Christmas 2 years ago, driven my 15-year-old Honda Civic across town to Ridgemont Estates, and knocked on the door of the house I'd only been invited to a handful of times. Vivienne had answered wearing cream-colored yoga pants that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and a matching sports bra top that showed her toned, tanned midriff. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect high ponytail, her makeup flawless, even though it was 2:30 in the afternoon. She looked like she'd just stepped out of an athleisure magazine. "Eleanor," she'd said, not bothering with any warmth in her greeting. Her eyes flicked over my outfit with thinly veiled disdain. "Julian didn't mention you were stopping by." I'd held up the small bag I'd brought, a bottle of modest champagne I'd splurged on from the grocery store, and 3 champagne flutes I'd wrapped carefully in newspaper. "I'd wanted to surprise you both. I have news I wanted to share in person." Vivienne had sighed, actually sighed, like I was an unexpected delivery she'd have to deal with. But she'd stepped aside, gesturing me into the cavernous foyer with its marble floors and modern chandelier that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Julian's in his study doing paperwork," she'd said, already walking toward the back of the house, her designer athletic shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. I'd stood in that massive foyer, feeling small and out of place. Everything in the house screamed money and taste, from the abstract paintings on the walls that I couldn't begin to understand, to the furniture that looked beautiful but deeply uncomfortable. There wasn't a personal photo anywhere, no evidence that real people lived here. It looked like a showroom.
Julian had emerged from his study looking tired. At 46, my son was still handsome, with his father's strong features and my dark hair, though now streaked with distinguished gray at the temples. But there was a weariness around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before he married Vivienne. "Mom," he'd said, and at least his hug was genuine, even if it was brief. "What brings you by?" "I have wonderful news," I'd said, unable to contain my smile, despite my discomfort in this cold, perfect house. "Can we sit? I brought champagne." Vivienne had led us to the living room, all white sofas and glass coffee tables and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked their perfectly landscaped backyard. I'd perched on the edge of one of those white sofas, terrified I'd somehow stain it with my presence, while Julian sat in the matching armchair and Vivienne remained standing, arms crossed, like she was waiting for a meeting to start so she could get back to more important things. "So," Julian had said with an encouraging smile, "what's the news, Mom?" I'd taken a deep breath, let the joy bubble up through my nervousness, and said, "I'm going to Paris. I finally saved enough money. I booked a tour. Everything's arranged, completely safe, very well organized. I leave March 15th for 2 weeks, 2 whole weeks in Paris." The words had tumbled out in a rush of excitement, and for a moment, I'd watched Julian's face soften with what looked like genuine happiness for me. "Mom, that's—" But Vivienne had cut him off before he could finish. "Paris?" Her voice had been sharp, disbelieving. "Eleanor, that's completely irresponsible." The joy had drained from me, like someone had pulled a plug. "I'm sorry?" Vivienne had moved closer, and I'd noticed she was wearing perfume that probably cost more than my monthly utility bill. "Eleanor, you're 70 years old. You can barely operate your email. Do you honestly think you should be traveling internationally at your age?"
The words had hit me like physical blows. Vivienne, it's a guided tour. Everything is organized. The company specializes in senior travel. Senior travel? That's just a polite way of saying they take advantage of elderly people who don't know any better. Eleanor, be realistic. What if something happens to you? What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? What if you get confused and lost in a foreign country where you don't speak the language? There are English-speaking guides, and I have travel insurance. Who do you think will have to deal with the crisis when, not if, but when something goes wrong? Vivienne turned to Julian, her voice rising. Can you imagine getting a call that your mother is in a Paris hospital or lost in the metro system or worse? Who's going to drop everything and fly to France to rescue her when she's in over her head? Julian had shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, I think Vivienne might have a point. Paris is pretty far away, and you'd be essentially alone. I won't be alone, I protested, feeling tears starting to build behind my eyes. There's a tour group, other travelers my age, professional guides who do this for a living. Other elderly people who also shouldn't be traveling unsupervised. Vivienne had interrupted, her tone growing more condescending. Honestly, Eleanor, this is exactly the kind of impulsive, poorly thought-out decision-making that concerns us about your judgment. I've been planning this for 5 years. This isn't impulsive. This has been my dream since I was a girl. I saved every penny. Your dream, Vivienne had repeated, like the concept itself was absurd. What about your responsibilities? What about Julian? What if he needs you and you're off playing tourist in France? I'll only be gone 2 weeks. 2 weeks when literally anything could happen to you. Do you know how many elderly tourists end up victims of pickpockets in Paris? Or fall and break hips on those uneven cobblestones? Or have heart attacks from overexertion? She'd walked over to the window, her back to me, her voice taking on that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. Eleanor, I understand it's difficult to accept that you're not young anymore, but you need to face reality about your limitations. I looked desperately at Julian, silently begging him to defend me, to tell his wife she was being unreasonable and cruel. Instead, he had avoided my eyes and said quietly, Mom, we're just worried about your safety. Maybe it would be better to do something closer to home. There's that nice bed and breakfast in the Blue Ridge Mountains, only 3 hours drive. Or what about Savannah? That's supposed to be charming, and we could drive down to check on you if needed. I don't need to be checked on, I said, my voice breaking. I'm not a child. I'm a capable adult who's earned the right to take a vacation to a place I've dreamed about my entire life. Vivienne had turned back to face me, and she had actually laughed. The sound was sharp and dismissive, like I'd told a joke that wasn't even clever enough to be funny. Earned the right, she said. Eleanor, you're 70 years old. You're too old to be gallivanting around Europe. Stay home where you belong, where it's safe, where you're not creating liability and stress for everyone else when things inevitably go wrong. The room went completely silent. The words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into my lungs, making it hard to breathe. Stay home where you belong. Too old. Liability. I'd stood up slowly, my legs feeling weak beneath me. The champagne bottle was still in the bag at my feet, the celebration that would never happen. I should go, I managed to say. Mom, wait. Julian had started, finally showing some sign of discomfort with how this conversation had gone, but Vivienne had cut him off again. I think that's for the best. Let her go home and really think about what we've said. Once she calms down and considers it rationally, she'll realize we're right. I'd picked up my bag with the champagne still inside, my hands trembling so badly I'd nearly dropped it. As I'd walked toward the door, Vivienne had followed me, her voice calling out one final blow. Oh, and Eleanor, you should probably cancel that tour as soon as possible. I'm sure there are penalties, but better to lose a deposit than end up stranded in a Paris hospital or worse, don't you think? Besides, I'm sure that money could be better spent on something more practical. Maybe you could finally replace that ancient car of yours before it dies on the highway. I'd walked out of that house without another word, climbed into my ancient Honda Civic, and driven home in a fog of shock and hurt so profound I could barely see the road through my tears. When I finally made it back to my small apartment above the bakery, I'd collapsed on my worn couch and let myself fall apart completely. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal inside me. Mourning not just for the dismissal of my dreams, but for the loss of the relationship with my son that I'd thought we had. Too old, a burden, impulsive, poor judgment, liability. Was that how they saw me? How Julian saw me? Had I really become nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed, a potential crisis to be prevented? I'd looked around my small apartment through tear-blurred eyes. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, a bathroom with tiles from the 1970s, walls that needed paint I couldn't afford. But it was mine, paid for with my library salary and my quilting sales. Nobody had bought it for me or held it over my head. My eyes had fallen on the photos scattered throughout the space. Thomas and me on our wedding day, both of us so young and full of hope. Julian as a baby, as a toddler, at his high school graduation. Sandra and me at her 60th birthday party, both of us laughing at some joke I could no longer remember. My quilting circle friends at our annual retreat last summer. Then my gaze had landed on the Paris guidebook sitting on my coffee table, the same guidebook I'd purchased 20 years ago and studied until the pages were soft and the spine was cracked. The Eiffel Tower on the cover, lit up at night, promising magic and beauty and everything I'd been denied my entire life by circumstances beyond my control. I'd picked up that guidebook with shaking hands and held it against my chest, feeling my heart pound beneath it. No. The word had formed in my mind with crystalline clarity. No, I would not cancel my tour. No, I would not accept their assessment of me as too old, too incompetent, too much of a liability to live my own life. No, I would not let Vivienne's cruelty or Julian's cowardice steal the stream from me again. I'd stood up, walked to my computer, and opened my email. There was the confirmation from Heritage European Tours sent just 3 days ago. My finger hovered over the cancel booking button. Instead, I'd closed that email and opened a new one. Dear Heritage European Tours, I am writing to confirm my attendance on the March 15th Paris tour. Additionally, I would like to inquire about any optional excursions or experiences I can add to my itinerary. I want to see and experience everything Paris has to offer. I want the full adventure. Please send me information on any additional tours, special dinners, museum visits, or other opportunities available. Thank you. Sincerely, Eleanor Whitmore. I'd hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately composed another email to my supervisor at the library, formally requesting the 2 weeks off in March. Then I'd opened a new document and started making lists. What I'd need to pack, medications to bring, travel adapter to purchase, comfortable walking shoes to break in, a new journal to record my experiences. If Vivienne thought I was too old to travel, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. If Julian wouldn't stand up for me or believe in me, I'd believe in myself. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have possibly imagined as I sat there, planning my trip with renewed determination, was that while I was preparing to prove them wrong about my capabilities, I was about to discover something far more disturbing about why Vivienne was so desperate to keep me close to home and under her control. Something that had nothing to do with my safety and everything to do with money, manipulation, and a scheme that would make my blood run cold when I finally uncovered it. But that discovery was still weeks away. For now, in the aftermath of that terrible afternoon, I simply held onto my dream with both hands and refused to let anyone take it from me again. The Paris guidebook stayed on my coffee table, and every morning when I woke up, it was the first thing I saw. A promise that March 15th was coming, whether Vivienne liked it or not.
The days following that disastrous announcement at Julian and Vivienne's house passed in a strange haze of determination mixed with hurt. I went through my routines at the library, checking out books, shelving returns, reading to the children on Saturday mornings. But part of my mind was always in Paris, walking through my upcoming adventure like a rehearsal. Mrs. Chen noticed something was different. On Thursday afternoon, as I was reorganizing the travel section, ironic given my current situation, she appeared beside me with 2 cups of tea from the break room. Eleanor, she said gently, you've been alphabetizing the same 3 books for 10 minutes. Want to talk about what's on your mind? I'd told her everything about the years of saving, the tour booking, my excitement, and then the crushing conversation with Vivienne and Julian. Mrs. Chen had listened without interrupting, her face growing more outraged with each detail. That's absolutely ridiculous, she'd said when I finished. Eleanor, you're one of the sharpest people I know. You manage our entire cataloging system. You taught me how to use the new computer software when I was ready to throw the whole machine out the window, and you navigate the county library network better than people half your age. Too old to travel? That's insulting. Her words had been a balm to my wounded spirit, but they couldn't erase the deeper hurt, that my own son had stood by and let his wife dismiss me so cruelly. I'm going anyway, I'd said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I don't care what they think. I've earned this trip. Mrs. Chen had raised her teacup in a mock toast. Good for you. And when you get back, I want to hear every single detail. Bring me back one of those touristy Eiffel Tower keychains. The tackier, the better. That conversation had fortified me, reminded me that I had people in my life who saw my worth, even if my own family seemed to have forgotten it. But Vivienne wasn't done. The first call came that Friday evening. I was working on a new quilt, a pattern of interlocking rings and shades of blue that reminded me of the stained brass I'd seen in pictures of Notre Dame Cathedral, when my phone rang. Julian's name appeared on the screen. My heart had leapt with hope. Maybe he'd called to apologize, to tell me he'd thought about it and supported my trip after all. Hi, sweetheart, I answered, trying to keep my voice light. Mom. His voice had been strained, uncomfortable. I wanted to check in with you. Have you thought more about the Paris situation? The Paris situation. Like my lifelong dream was a problem that needed solving. I've thought about it, I said carefully, and I'm still going. Julian, this trip means everything to me. Mom, please listen. Vivienne is really worried about you. She barely slept last night thinking about all the things that could go wrong. She's been researching elder travel incidents, and the statistics are actually pretty concerning. I felt my jaw tighten. Julian, I'm not a statistic. I'm your mother, and I'm a competent adult who's capable of following a tour guide through Paris. But that's just it. You think you're capable, but you don't always see your limitations. Remember last month when you got confused about the new parking meters downtown and ended up getting a ticket? The parking meters are needlessly complicated, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. That has nothing to do with my ability to follow a tour guide through Paris. Mom, I'm just asking you to really think about this. Is this trip worth the risk? Worth potentially ending up alone and frightened in a foreign country if something goes wrong? Julian, I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Your father made me promise on his deathbed that I'd go to Paris. Sandra made me promise the same thing before she died. This isn't a whim or impulse. This is me keeping promises to the people I loved most in this world. There had been a long silence on the other end. Finally, Julian said quietly, Dad would want you to be safe more than he'd want you to take unnecessary risks. Your father would want me to live, I shot back, my voice breaking. Not just exist, not just survive, but actually live. And that's what I'm trying to do. Another silence, then Vivienne's voice in the background, sharp and insistent, though I couldn't make out the words. Look, Mom, just think about it, okay? We'll talk later. And he'd hung up before I could respond. I'd sat there staring at my half-finished quilt, my hands shaking too badly to continue stitching. This was just the beginning, I'd realized. They weren't going to let this go. The second call came on Sunday afternoon. This time, it was Vivienne directly, her voice syrupy with false concern. Eleanor, hi, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I was just finishing lunch, I said, warily. Perfect. Listen, I've been doing some research about travel options for seniors, and I found some wonderful alternatives to that Paris tour. There's a lovely local travel club that does day trips. They went to a winery last month, and everyone had a marvelous time. Very safe, very organized, and you're back home by evening. I thought maybe... Vivienne, I interrupted. I appreciate your concern, but I'm going to Paris. The tour's booked, the money's paid, and I'm not canceling.
Her voice had gone cold immediately. Eleanor, I really think you're being selfish about this. Have you considered how this affects Julian? The stress you're putting on him? Stress I'm putting on him? I'd felt anger rising in my chest. Vivienne, I'm taking a vacation. That's not something that should stress anyone. It stresses him because he loves you, and he's worried about you making poor decisions. And frankly, Eleanor, your judgment hasn't been great lately. Julian told me about the credit card bill you couldn't figure out last month. I had a question about a charge, I'd said, my voice shaking now with fury. One charge that I didn't recognize. That's normal, not evidence of declining mental capacity. And then there was the time you forgot about your doctor's appointment. I had the date wrong in my calendar. I rescheduled. People do that all the time. Eleanor. Vivienne's voice had taken on that patronizing tone I was growing to hate. I know it's hard to admit when we're not as sharp as we used to be, but the people who love you can see it even if you can't. These little incidents add up. They paint a picture of someone who maybe shouldn't be traveling internationally alone. I wanted to scream. Instead, I'd said as calmly as I could manage, Vivienne, I need to go now. I have things to do. Just promise me you'll keep thinking about... I hung up. Actually hung up on her, something I'd never done to anyone in my life. My hands had been shaking so badly I'd dropped the phone. This was harassment. That's what this was. They were trying to wear me down to make me doubt myself until I gave in and canceled the trip just to make them stop. But something else was nagging at me, a small voice in the back of my mind asking, why? Why did they care so much? Yes, Vivienne had framed it as concern for my safety, but the intensity of her campaign felt disproportionate. I'd known plenty of elderly people who traveled. My friend Dorothy from the quilting circle had gone to Italy last year at age 73 and had a wonderful time. Why was my trip being treated like I had announced plans to go skydiving? The campaign intensified over the next week. Julian called 3 more times, each conversation a variation on the same theme. They were worried. I wasn't thinking clearly. Wouldn't you reconsider? Vivienne sent me articles, actual articles about elderly travelers who'd had problems abroad. Falls, confusion, medical emergencies, scams targeting seniors. She even had Julian's receptionist, a woman named Carol, who I'd always liked, call me with concern. Mrs. Whittemore, I'm calling because Vivienne asked me to. She's worried about you, and she thought maybe hearing from someone outside the family might help. She mentioned you're planning to travel abroad, and she just wants you to know there are people who care about your well-being. I'd been polite to Carol. None of this was her fault, but I'd firmly told her that my travel plans were none of Vivienne's business and that I'd appreciate it if she'd tell her employer's wife to stop recruiting people to change my mind. Then came the Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after my initial announcement, when everything escalated to a new level. I'd just gotten home from my evening shift at the library and was making myself a simple dinner of soup and toast when someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends usually called first, but I assumed it might be Mr. Petrov from downstairs who sometimes needed help with his computer. Instead, when I opened the door, Julian and Vivienne stood there. Both of them, unannounced, at 7:30 in the evening. Mom, we need to talk. Can we come in? I wanted to say no, to tell them to leave, but decades of ingrained politeness and maternal instinct won out. I stepped aside and let them into my small apartment, suddenly hyper-aware of how shabby everything must look to Vivienne's critical eye. She had glanced around with barely concealed distaste. At my secondhand furniture, at the quilt pieces scattered on the coffee table, at the stack of library books I'd checked out about Paris. This won't take long, she had said, not bothering to sit down.
we've come to present you with an alternative proposal. An alternative proposal? I'd echoed, feeling like I'd stepped into a business negotiation rather than a family conversation. Julian had pulled out his phone and brought up something on the screen. Mom, we've done a lot of research over the past 2 weeks. We've talked to travel agents, we've consulted with medical professionals, and we've looked into safer options for someone in your demographic. My demographic? I repeated flatly. Seniors who want to travel but need additional support and oversight. Vivienne had clarified, as if I were a child who needed simple words. And we found something perfect. There's a senior living community called Golden Horizons about 40 minutes from here. They have a travel program specifically designed for elderly residents. Supervised trips with medical personnel on staff, all domestic travel, very safe and controlled. I stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. You want me to move into a senior living community so I can take their supervised field trips instead of going to Paris? It's not just about the travel, Julian had said quickly, and something in his tone had made my stomach drop. Mom, Vivienne and I have been talking, and we think maybe it's time to consider transitioning to a more supported living situation anyway. Transitioning? You mean you want me to go live in a nursing home?
It's not a nursing home, Vivienne had said, her voice taking on that sugary sweet tone that made my skin crawl. It's independent living with services. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be staff available if you needed help. Meals provided, activities organized, medical support on site. It's really quite nice. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I want to go to Paris, I'd said, hearing the tremor in my voice. It has everything to do with Paris, Vivienne had snapped, her patience apparently exhausted. Eleanor, the fact that you think you can handle international travel alone proves that your judgment is impaired. A rational person your age would see the risks. The fact that you're being stubborn and reckless about this shows us that you need more oversight. I'm not being reckless. I'm taking a guided tour with a reputable company. You're 70 years old with no one to look after you. You live alone in this, she waved her hand around dismissively, this apartment with stairs you could fall down. You drive a car that's older than most high school students. You work at a library for barely above minimum wage. Eleanor, you're one emergency away from a crisis, and Julian and I are tired of waiting for that crisis to happen. The words had hung in the air like a slap. Julian had looked uncomfortable, but hadn't contradicted anything his wife had said. Get out, I'd said quietly. Mom, Julian had started. Get out of my apartment. Now. Eleanor, we're trying to help you, Vivienne had said, her voice sharp with frustration. We're trying to prevent you from making a huge mistake. The only mistake I made was thinking my son would support me instead of letting his wife bully me into giving up my dreams. I'd walked to the door and opened it. I'm going to Paris in March. I'm not moving into a senior facility, and I'm not going to let you make me feel incompetent or crazy for wanting to live my life. Now please leave. Julian had looked like he wanted to say something, but Vivienne had grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. Fine, go to Paris. But when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, don't expect us to come running to save you. You're on your own, Eleanor. They'd left, Vivienne's heels clicking sharply on the wooden stairs as they descended. I'd closed the door behind them and locked it, then leaned against it as my legs gave out. I'd slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the door, and finally let myself fall apart. They wanted to put me in a home. Not because I needed care, not because I couldn't manage on my own, but because I dared to plan a trip they didn't approve of, because I wouldn't stay in the small box they'd decided was appropriate for a woman my age. I'd sat there on the floor of my apartment for nearly an hour, crying and then just staring at nothing, feeling more alone than I'd felt since Thomas died. But gradually, as the shock wore off, something else crept in. Not just hurt or anger, but suspicion. The intensity of Vivienne's opposition to my trip still didn't make sense. Even factoring in her controlling personality and her clear disdain for me, this level of interference felt excessive.
The suggestion that I move into a senior living facility felt like an escalation that went beyond mere concern, no matter how condescendingly expressed. And there was something Julian had said that kept replaying in my mind. Julian and I are tired of waiting for that crisis to happen. Waiting for what crisis? I was healthy, I managed my own affairs, I had friends, activities, a job I loved. What crisis were they anticipating that would justify taking over my life? I'd pulled myself up from the floor and walked to my small desk where I kept my financial paperwork. Everything was organized in clearly labeled folders: utilities, insurance, bank statements, medical records. I'd always been meticulous about record keeping, a habit Thomas had instilled in me years ago. I'd pulled out my bank statements from the past 6 months and spread them across my kitchen table, not sure what I was looking for but feeling compelled to check. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My pension from the years I'd worked full-time at the library before Thomas got sick, my part-time wages from my current hours, the small amounts from quilt sales. Then I'd noticed something odd. In my savings account, the Paris Fund, there had been a transfer I didn't recognize. It was from 3 months ago, a withdrawal of $500. I frowned at it, racking my brain. I hadn't taken out $500. I'd been so careful, so meticulous about that account. Every penny that went in was documented, and the only money that came out was the payment for the tour. I'd pulled out older statements, going back further. There. Another one. 6 months ago, a withdrawal of $350. And before that, 5 months before that, $600. My hands started shaking as I laid out all the statements going back a full year. 7 unauthorized withdrawals, totaling $2,800. Someone had been taking money from my Paris fund. I looked at the withdrawal method for each one. They weren't ATM withdrawals, those would have required my PIN. They were electronic transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The account number was partially obscured on the statements, showing only the last 4 digits, 7392. My heart was pounding as I tried to think rationally. Could this be a mistake? A bank error? But 7 different transfers over the course of a year wasn't a mistake. This was systematic. Someone had access to my account and had been slowly draining money from it. But who? And how? Then I remembered something else. Last Christmas, Julian and Vivienne had given me a new phone, a smartphone to replace my old flip phone. Vivienne had insisted on setting it up for me, installing apps, connecting it to my email and bank accounts so I could manage everything more easily.
It's not a nursing home, Vivienne had said, her voice taking on that sugary sweet tone that made my skin crawl. It's independent living with services. You'd have your own apartment, but there'd be staff available if you needed help. Meals provided, activities organized, medical support on site. It's really quite nice. And it has nothing to do with the fact that I want to go to Paris, I'd said, hearing the tremor in my voice. It has everything to do with Paris, Vivienne had snapped, her patience apparently exhausted. Eleanor, the fact that you think you can handle international travel alone proves that your judgment is impaired. A rational person your age would see the risks. The fact that you're being stubborn and reckless about this shows us that you need more oversight. I'm not being reckless. I'm taking a guided tour with a reputable company. You're 70 years old with no one to look after you. You live alone in this, she waved her hand around dismissively, this apartment with stairs you could fall down. You drive a car that's older than most high school students. You work at a library for barely above minimum wage. Eleanor, you're one emergency away from a crisis, and Julian and I are tired of waiting for that crisis to happen. The words had hung in the air like a slap. Julian had looked uncomfortable, but hadn't contradicted anything his wife had said. Get out, I'd said, quietly. Mom, Julian had started. Get out of my apartment, now. Eleanor, we're trying to help you, Vivienne had said, her voice sharp with frustration. We're trying to prevent you from making a huge mistake. The only mistake I made was thinking my son would support me instead of letting his wife bully me into giving up my dreams. I'd walked to the door and opened it.
I'm going to Paris in March. I'm not moving into a senior facility, and I'm not going to let you make me feel incompetent or crazy for wanting to live my life. Now please leave." Julian had looked like he wanted to say something, but Vivienne had grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door. "Fine, go to Paris. But when something goes wrong, and it will go wrong, don't expect us to come running to save you. You're on your own, Eleanor." They'd left, Vivienne's heels clicking sharply on the wooden stairs as they descended. I'd closed the door behind them and locked it, then leaned against it as my legs gave out. I'd slid down to sit on the floor, my back against the door, and finally let myself fall apart. They wanted to put me in a home, not because I needed care, not because I couldn't manage on my own, but because I dared to plan a trip they didn't approve of. Because I wouldn't stay in the small box they'd decided was appropriate for a woman my age. I'd sat there on the floor of my apartment for nearly an hour, crying and then just staring at nothing, feeling more alone than I'd felt since Thomas died. But gradually, as the shock wore off, something else crept in. Not just hurt or anger, but suspicion. The intensity of Vivienne's opposition to my trip still didn't make sense. Even factoring in her controlling personality and her clear disdain for me, this level of interference felt excessive. The suggestion that I move into a senior living facility felt like an escalation that went beyond mere concern, no matter how condescendingly expressed. And there was something Julian had said that kept replaying in my mind. Julian and I are tired of waiting for that crisis to happen? Waiting for what crisis? I was healthy. I managed my own affairs. I had friends, activities, a job I loved. What crisis were they anticipating that would justify taking over my life? I'd pulled myself up from the floor and walked to my small desk where I kept my financial paperwork. Everything was organized in clearly labeled folders: utilities, insurance, bank statements, medical records. I'd always been meticulous about record keeping, a habit Thomas had instilled in me years ago. I'd pulled out my bank statements from the past 6 months and spread them across my kitchen table, not sure what I was looking for, but feeling compelled to check. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My pension from the years I'd worked full-time at the library before Thomas got sick, my part-time wages for my current hours, the small amounts from quilt sales. Then I noticed something odd. In my savings account, the Paris fund, there had been a transfer I didn't recognize. It was from 3 months ago, a withdrawal of $500. I frowned at it, racking my brain. I hadn't taken out $500. I'd been so careful, so meticulous about that account. Every penny that went in was documented, and the only money that came out was the payment for the tour. I'd pulled out older statements, going back further. There. Another one. 6 months ago, a withdrawal of $350. And before that, 5 months before that, $600. My hands had started shaking as I laid out all the statements, going back a full year. 7 unauthorized withdrawals, totaling $2,800. Someone had been taking money from my Paris fund. I looked at the withdrawal method for each one. They weren't ATM withdrawals. Those would have required my PIN. They were electronic transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The account number was partially obscured on the statements, showing only the last 4 digits, 7392. My heart had been pounding as I tried to think rationally. Could this be a mistake? A bank error? But 7 different transfers over the course of a year wasn't a mistake. This was systematic. Someone had access to my account and had been slowly draining money from it. But who? And how? Then I'd remembered something. Last Christmas, Julian and Vivienne gave me a new phone, a smartphone to replace my old flip phone. Vivienne had insisted on setting it up for me, installing apps, connecting it to my email and bank accounts so I could manage everything more easily.
I'd been grateful at the time, touched that they'd thought of it, and Vivienne had been so patient, spending an entire afternoon teaching me how to use it, entering all my passwords for me so I wouldn't have to struggle with the tiny keyboard. All my passwords, including my bank account password. The realization had hit me like a physical blow. Vivienne had access to my bank account. She'd had it for almost a year since that Christmas, and she'd been quietly, systematically stealing from me. But why? Vivienne and Julian weren't hurting for money. Julian's medical practice was successful, and Vivienne's pharmaceutical sales job paid well. Why would she steal $2,800 from my modest savings? Unless it wasn't about the money itself. Unless it was about control. I'd sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, my mind racing through the past year. All the times Vivienne had commented on my financial situation, suggesting I might need help managing my affairs, asking invasive questions about my savings and spending. The way she'd pushed so hard against the Paris trip, calling it irresponsible and suggesting I couldn't afford it. What if she'd been trying to drain my Paris fund so I couldn't afford to go? What if the entire goal was to make sure I stayed exactly where I was, dependent, controllable, someone who needed their help and oversight? And the push to move me into Golden Horizons? If I was in assisted living, they could really take over my finances, couldn't they? I'd probably have to give them power of attorney or some kind of financial oversight. They'd control everything. I'd looked around my small apartment with new eyes. This wasn't much, but it was mine. My independence, my autonomy, my right to make my own choices. That's what they wanted to take from me. And they'd been laying the groundwork for months, possibly longer. The Paris trip had just forced their hand, made them accelerate their timeline, because I was about to do something that proved I didn't need their oversight at all. My soup had gone cold on the stove, forgotten. I'd sat at that kitchen table until nearly midnight, documenting everything: the unauthorized transfers, the dates of Vivienne's comments and interference, the timeline of their increasing pressure for me to accept help. I'd also noticed something else as I reviewed my bank statements more carefully. There were several small charges on my checking account, $15 here, $30 there, from stores I'd never shopped at. Nothing large enough to alarm me when I'd glanced at the statements before, but now that I was looking carefully, I could see at least a dozen small fraudulent charges over the past year. Vivienne hadn't just taken money from my savings, she'd been using my checking account like her own personal petty cash fund. The total amount stolen was probably close to $3,500, maybe more if I went back further than a year. But I still had one crucial question. Could I prove it? The transfers showed an account number, but I didn't know for certain it was Vivienne's. The charges could theoretically be fraud from an unknown source. I needed more evidence before I confronted them or went to the police. I'd opened my laptop, which I'd bought myself and set up myself, thank God, and started researching. By 2 a.m., I'd learned about bank fraud investigations, how to request detailed transfer information, and what documentation I'd need to prove theft. I'd also learned something else. There was a way to see exactly where those electronic transfers had gone. I could request full account details from the bank, including the complete account number and name on the receiving account. As I'd finally climbed into bed that night, exhausted but grimly determined, I'd realized something important. Vivienne's campaign to stop my Paris trip had accomplished something she never intended. It had made me look closely at my finances. It had made me suspicious enough to dig deeper. And now I knew. My daughter-in-law was a thief. But more than that, she was trying to manipulate me into giving up my independence, possibly to make it easier to steal even more. The question now was, what was I going to do about it? As I drifted off to sleep that night, one thought had crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I was still going to Paris, but before I left, I was going to make absolutely certain that when I returned, Vivienne would be the one whose life was turned upside down, not mine. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming. I couldn't go to the police yet, not without solid proof that the transfers went to Vivienne's account, but I could start building my case. My first stop was the bank. I dressed carefully in my most professional-looking outfit, the navy pantsuit I wear to quilting circle presentations, and walked into Millbrook Springs First National at 9 a.m. sharp when they opened. I need to speak with someone about unauthorized transactions on my account, and I'd like to request detailed information about several electronic transfers, I'd told the receptionist, keeping my voice calm and professional. They'd set me up with a banking specialist named Marcus Wu, a serious young man in his 30s who'd listen carefully as I explained the situation. I've discovered several transfers from my savings account that I didn't authorize. I need complete information about where this money went, the full account number and name on the receiving account. Marcus had frowned as he reviewed the statements. Mrs. Whitmore, this is concerning. These transfers were initiated online using your login credentials. Do you think someone might have access to your account information? I know exactly who has access. My daughter-in-law set up online banking for me last Christmas. She entered all my passwords.
His frown had deepened. That's unfortunately a common scenario we see with elder financial abuse. I can absolutely get you this information, but it may take a few days. We'll need to pull detailed records from our archives. Elder financial abuse. Hearing the term spoken out loud had made it real in a way it hadn't been when I was just suspecting. How long will it take? I'd asked. 3 to 5 business days for the complete records. In the meantime, I strongly recommend we change all your passwords and set up additional security measures on your account. I'd also suggest enabling two-factor authentication. That means any transaction over a certain amount would require confirmation via text message to your phone. Yes, I'd said immediately. Yes, let's do all of that. We'd spent the next hour securing my accounts, new passwords that only I knew, two-factor authentication, alerts set up for any transaction over $50. Marcus had been thorough and kind, never once making me feel foolish for having trusted the wrong person. Mrs. Whitmore, he'd said as we finished, I want you to know that what's happening to you isn't uncommon, and it's not your fault. Family members often have the easiest access to commit financial fraud because victims trust them. The fact that you caught it and you're taking action shows you're more capable than whoever's doing this counted on. His words had meant more than he probably knew. As I'd left the bank, I'd felt something shift inside me. I wasn't a victim. I was someone fighting back. My next stop had been the Millbrook Springs Police Department. I hadn't wanted to file a formal complaint yet, not without absolute proof, but I'd wanted to establish a record, to create a paper trail. The officer at the front desk had directed me to a detective, Sarah Reeves, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Tell me what's going on, she'd said, pulling out a notepad. I'd explained everything. The parish trip, Vivienne's opposition, the escalating pressure to move into assisted living, and finally, the discovery of the unauthorized transfers. Detective Reeves had listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, Mrs. Whitmore, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of financial exploitation of an elderly person, coupled with what might be an attempt to establish grounds for conservatorship. Conservatorship? The word had sent a chill through me. It's when someone petitions the court to be appointed as your legal guardian, essentially taking over your financial and personal decisions. It's meant for people who truly can't manage their own affairs, severe dementia, incapacitation, that sort of thing. But unfortunately, it's sometimes abused by family members who want control over an elderly relative's assets. But I don't have significant assets. I have a small pension and some savings, nothing worth. It's not always about how much money is involved, Detective Reeves interrupted gently. Sometimes it's about control, or sometimes people are positioning themselves for future gain, like if you own property, or if you have life insurance, or if there's an inheritance they're expecting. I thought about the small life insurance policy Thomas had left me. Only $50,000, meant to cover my final expenses and maybe leave a little for Julian. And my apartment. Technically, I don't own it, but I'd paid Mr. Chen, the building owner, a lump sum years ago that functioned like a lifetime lease. When I died, there'd be about $30,000 equity that would go to Julian. Not a fortune by any means, but more than I'd thought of as assets. Here's what I recommend, Detective Reeves had said. First, get those detailed bank records. If they show the transfers went to your daughter-in-law's account, that's evidence we can use. Second, document everything. Every conversation, every attempt to pressure you, every instance where they've suggested you're not competent to manage your own affairs. Keep a journal, save emails and text messages, everything. Will that be enough to press charges? I'd asked. Possibly, but I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. Financial abuse cases involving family members can be complicated. Prosecutors sometimes hesitate because these situations can be murky. She gave me access to her accounts. She told me I could help myself to money when I needed it. Those are common defenses. The stronger your documentation, the better. I had left the police station with a mixture of validation and frustration. I was being taken seriously, which was a relief, but the path to justice seemed long and uncertain. Over the next few days, I'd thrown myself into documentation. I'd started a detailed journal, going back and reconstructing every concerning interaction with Vivienne and Julian over the past year. The comments about my competence, the suggestions that I needed help, the Christmas phone setup that had given her access to my accounts. I'd neatly realized that Vivienne had been laying groundwork, planting seeds with people in my community that I was declining mentally, so that when she eventually made a move to take over my affairs, there would already be people who'd heard concerns about me.
It was diabolical, really, and frighteningly methodical. 5 days after my visit to the bank, Marcus had called. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have those records you requested. Could you come by the bank this afternoon?" I'd driven there immediately, my heart pounding. This was it. The evidence that would prove everything. Marcus had handed me a manila envelope. "Everything you requested is in there. I reviewed it before I called you, and Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're going to want to see this with someone supporting you. The account that received those transfers is registered to Vivienne Ashford Whitmore." There it was. Proof. I'd opened the envelope right there at his desk, my hands shaking. Page after page of detailed transaction records showing money transferred from my savings account to an account clearly identified as belonging to Vivienne. The dates, amounts, and receiving account information were all documented with official bank stamps and signatures. This is enough, isn't it? To press charges? Marcus had nodded. This is clear evidence of unauthorized transfers. The bank will support any legal action you choose to take. We have no record of you authorizing these transfers or giving her permission to access these funds. I'd driven home with that envelope on the passenger seat like it was made of gold. Finally, I had proof. Finally, I could fight back. But as I'd pulled into my parking space behind the bakery, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Julian's car was parked on the street outside. And he wasn't alone. Through my rearview mirror, I could see him sitting in the driver's seat, talking on his phone. And standing on the sidewalk next to his car was someone I didn't recognize. A middle-aged woman in a business suit, holding a briefcase. They were waiting for me. I sat in my car for a moment, my mind racing. This felt like an ambush. But I couldn't sit here forever. I'd gathered my courage, clutched the envelope of bank records to my chest, and gotten out of my car. Julian had ended his phone call and stepped out of his car as I approached. His face had been serious, almost sad. "Mom, we need to talk. This is Dr. Patricia Henley. She's a geriatric psychiatrist, and Vivienne and I have asked her to conduct an evaluation." The woman had smiled at me, professional and slightly pitying. "Mrs. Whitmore, your family is concerned about some recent decision-making patterns. I'd like to ask you some questions if you'll give me a few minutes of your time." My grip on the envelope tightened. They were trying to have me declared incompetent, right now. Today, without warning. The trap was closing, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I stood on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, clutching the envelope of bank records that proved Vivienne's theft, while my son and a psychiatrist he'd apparently hired waited for me to submit to an evaluation that could be used to declare me incompetent. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my hands, I held evidence that Vivienne was a criminal. In their minds, I was the one whose judgment was impaired. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Henley said again, her voice professionally gentle in that way that made my skin crawl. "Your family is concerned about some recent decision-making patterns. I'd like to ask you some questions if you'll give me a few minutes of your time." I looked at Julian, really looked at him. My son, whom I'd raised alone after Thomas got sick. The boy I'd worked 2 jobs to support through college. The man whose own father had made me promise to live my life fully after he was gone. And Julian couldn't even meet my eyes. "How long has this been planned?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Julian shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, it's not like that. We just want to make sure." "How long, Julian?" He finally looked at me. "Vivienne contacted Dr. Henley last week, after you refused to reconsider the Paris trip or discuss Golden Horizons. We thought maybe an objective professional could help you see that I'm incompetent." I finished for him. "That you need to be declared unfit to manage my own affairs so you and Vivienne can take over?" Dr. Henley interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Whitmore, no one is declaring anything. This is simply an evaluation, a conversation to assess your current cognitive function and decision-making capacity. It's a standard procedure when families have concerns." "I decline," I said firmly. Dr. Henley blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I decline the evaluation. I don't consent to being assessed by a doctor I've never met who was hired by people who have a vested interest in proving I'm incompetent without any advance notice or opportunity to prepare. That's my right, isn't it, doctor, to refuse?" A flicker of surprise crossed her professional mask. "Well, yes, you certainly have the right to decline a voluntary evaluation. However, I'd encourage you to reconsider. Your family's concerns seem quite genuine." "My family's concerns," I said, my voice rising now, "are self-serving lies designed to justify stealing from me and taking over my life." Julian's face went pale. "Mom, what are you talking about?"
It was diabolical, really, and frighteningly methodical. 5 days after my visit to the bank, Marcus had called. "Mrs. Whitmore, I have those records you requested. Could you come by the bank this afternoon?" I'd driven there immediately, my heart pounding. This was it. The evidence that would prove everything. Marcus had handed me a manila envelope. "Everything you requested is in there. I reviewed it before I called you. And, Mrs. Whitmore, I think you're going to want to see this with someone supporting you. The account that received those transfers is registered to Vivienne Ashford Whitmore." There it was, proof. I'd opened the envelope right there at his desk, my hands shaking. Page after page of detailed transaction records showing money transferred from my savings account to an account clearly identified as belonging to Vivienne. The dates, amounts, and receiving account information were all documented with official bank stamps and signatures. "This is enough, isn't it?" I'd asked. "To press charges?" Marcus had nodded. "This is clear evidence of unauthorized transfers. The bank will support any legal action you choose to take. We have no record of you authorizing these transfers or giving her permission to access these funds." I'd driven home with that envelope on the passenger seat like it was made of gold. Finally, I had proof. Finally, I could fight back. But as I'd pulled into my parking space behind the bakery, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Julian's car was parked on the street outside, and he wasn't alone. Through my rearview mirror, I could see him sitting in the driver's seat talking on his phone, and standing on the sidewalk next to his car was someone I didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in a business suit holding a briefcase. They were waiting for me. I sat in my car for a moment, my mind racing. This felt like an ambush, but I couldn't sit here forever. I gathered my courage, clutched the envelope of bank records to my chest, and gotten out of my car. Julian had ended his phone call and stepped out of his car as I approached. His face had been serious, almost sad. "Mom, we need to talk. This is Dr. Patricia Henley. She's a geriatric psychiatrist, and Vivienne and I have asked her to conduct an evaluation." The woman smiled at me, professional and slightly pitying. "Mrs. Whitmore, your family is concerned about some recent decision-making patterns. I'd like to ask you some questions if you'll give me a few minutes of your time." My grip on the envelope tightened. They were trying to have me declared incompetent, right now, today, without warning. The trap was closing, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I stood on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, clutching the envelope of bank records that proved Vivienne's theft, while my son and a psychiatrist he had apparently hired waited for me to submit to an evaluation that could be used to declare me incompetent. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my hands, I held evidence that Vivienne was a criminal. In their minds, I was the one whose judgment was impaired. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Henley said again, her voice professionally gentle in that way that made my skin crawl. "I understand this might feel unexpected, but your family's concerns are simply concerned about your well-being. A brief evaluation could put everyone's minds at ease." I looked at Julian, really looked at him. My son, whom I raised alone after Thomas got sick, the boy I worked 2 jobs to support through college, the man whose own father had made me promise to live my life fully after he was gone. And Julian couldn't even meet my eyes. "How long has this been planned?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Julian shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, it's not like that. We just want to make sure—" "How long, Julian?" He finally looked at me. "Vivienne contacted Dr. Henley last week, after you refused to reconsider the Paris trip or discuss Golden Horizons. We thought maybe an objective professional could help you see that I'm incompetent," I finished for him, "that I need to be declared unfit to manage my own affairs so you and Vivienne can take over." Dr. Henley interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Whitmore, no one is declaring anything. This is simply an evaluation, a conversation to assess your current cognitive function and decision-making capacity. It's a standard procedure when families have concerns." "I decline," I said firmly. Dr. Henley blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I decline the evaluation. I don't consent to being assessed by a doctor I've never met who was hired by people who have a vested interest in proving I'm incompetent without any advance notice or opportunity to prepare. That's my right, isn't it, doctor? To refuse?" A flicker of surprise crossed her professional mask. "Well, yes, you certainly have the right to decline a voluntary evaluation. However, I'd encourage you to reconsider. Your family's concerns seem quite genuine." "My family's concerns," I said, my voice rising now, "are self-serving lies designed to justify stealing from me and taking over my life." Julian's face went pale. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I held up the envelope. "I'm talking about the $3,500 that Vivienne has stolen from my bank accounts over the past year. I'm talking about the systematic financial fraud I discovered when I actually looked closely at my statements. I'm talking about the fact that your wife has been draining my Paris fund and using my checking account like her personal ATM. That's—" Julian started, then stopped. "That's not possible. Vivienne wouldn't."
"I have bank records that prove otherwise.
Complete transaction histories showing unauthorized transfers from my accounts to an account registered in her name. Your wife is a thief, Julian. And this evaluation, I gestured to Dr. Henley, this is her trying to cover her tracks by having me declared incompetent before I can expose what she's done. Dr. Henley had taken a step back, clearly uncomfortable with being in the middle of what was rapidly becoming a family accusation session. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps this isn't the right time. There's never going to be a right time, I said, looking directly at my son. Julian, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you know? Did you know that Vivienne was stealing from me? His face had gone from pale to gray. Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. I never authorized anyone to take money from your accounts. It wasn't exactly a denial, I noticed. He hadn't said Vivienne didn't do it. He'd said he hadn't authorized it. But you knew something was wrong, didn't you? I pressed. The way you've been pressuring me about Paris, about moving into assisted living, about giving up my independence. Some part of you knew this wasn't really about my safety, didn't it? Julian's eyes had filled with tears. For a moment, I saw my son again. Not Vivienne's husband, but the boy I'd raised. Mom, I was just trying to help. Vivienne said you were struggling financially, that you were making poor decisions. Vivienne lied, I said flatly. She lied to you, she lied about me, and she's been systematically robbing me while convincing you that I'm the one who can't be trusted. Dr. Henley cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps this isn't the right time. There's never going to be a right time, I said, looking directly at my son. Julian, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Did you know? Did you know that Vivienne was stealing from me? His face had gone from pale to gray. Mom, I don't know what you're talking about. I never authorized anyone to take money from your accounts. It wasn't exactly a denial, I noticed. He hadn't said Vivienne didn't do it. He'd said he hadn't authorized it. But you knew something was wrong, didn't you? I pressed. The way you've been pressuring me about Paris, about moving into assisted living, about giving up my independence. Some part of you knew this wasn't really about my safety, didn't it? Julian's eyes had filled with tears. For a moment, I saw my son again. Not Vivienne's husband, but the boy I'd raised. Mom, I was just trying to help. Vivienne said you were struggling financially, that you were making poor decisions. Vivienne lied, I said flatly. She lied to you, she lied about me, and she's been systematically robbing me while convincing you that I'm the one who can't be trusted. Dr. Henley cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, I think I should go. This is clearly a family matter that needs to be resolved privately, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to conduct an evaluation under these circumstances. She looked at me with something that might have been respect. Mrs. Whitmore, for what it's worth, you seem quite lucid and capable to me. I'd recommend you and your son continue this conversation without a psychiatrist present. She walked to her car and drove away, leaving Julian and me standing on the sidewalk in the fading afternoon light. Julian said finally, his voice hoarse, Show me the bank records." We went up to my apartment and I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Every unauthorized transfer, laid out in black and white. The receiving account number, registered to Vivienne Ashford Whitmore. The small fraudulent charges from stores I'd never visited. The systematic theft that had been going on for almost a year. Julian sat at my kitchen table and stared at the evidence, his face going through a series of emotions. Disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a kind of devastated understanding. "She told me you were giving her money," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said you insisted on helping us with expenses because you felt bad that we were spending money to check on you and help you with things. She said you were embarrassed to have it be a formal arrangement, so you just transferred money when you could spare it." My heart broke for him, even as I was furious at the situation.
Julian, honey, I never gave her a penny. I didn't even know money was missing until I started looking closely after she tried so hard to stop me from going to Paris. The Paris trip, he said, understanding dawning in his eyes. She didn't want you to go because you'd need your savings. You'd look at your accounts more carefully. You might discover what she'd done. And the push to get me into Golden Horizons, I added. If I was in assisted living, you'd probably need to take over my finances officially. She'd have even more access, more control. Julian put his head in his hands. Oh, God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought... She was so convincing. She showed me articles about elderly people getting scammed, having accidents while traveling. She talked about how much she cared about you, how worried she was. And when you seemed so stubborn about Paris, so unwilling to even consider our concerns, I thought... You thought I was being unreasonable, I finished gently. That's what she wanted you to think. She's been building that narrative for months, Julian. Telling my friends I was getting forgetful, documenting every small mistake I made, framing my normal life as evidence of decline. The phone, Julian said suddenly, looking up. Last Christmas, she spent hours setting up that smartphone for you. She told me she was being helpful, making it easier for you to manage everything. She was giving herself access to my accounts. That's when the theft started, right after Christmas. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Julian said, "What do you want to do? Are you going to press charges?" I'd thought about this question constantly over the past few days. I want my money back, all of it. And I want her to admit what she did. After that, I paused. After that, what happens depends on both of you. If she returns the money and you divorce her, I'll consider not pursuing criminal charges. But Julian, I need you to understand something. I will not be silenced. I will not pretend this didn't happen. And I will not allow her to continue having any access to my life or my finances. Julian nodded slowly. I need to talk to her. Tonight. I need to hear her explain this. Do you want me to come with you? No. I need to do this alone. But Mom, he reached across the table and took my hand. I'm so sorry for not believing you, for not protecting you, for letting her manipulate me into thinking you were the problem. I squeezed his hand. You believe me now, and that matters.
After Julian left, I sat in my apartment and waited. I didn't know what would happen at his house, what confrontation was taking place, what excuses or explanations Vivienne might offer. Part of me expected my phone to ring, to hear Vivienne's voice spitting accusations and denials. Instead, 3 hours later, Julian called. She admitted it, he said without preamble, his voice hollow. Not at first. At first, she tried to say it was a misunderstanding, that you'd given her permission, that I was overreacting. But when I showed her the bank records, when I told her I'd spoken to the bank myself, and they confirmed you'd never authorized the transfers, she admitted it. What did she say? I asked. She said... Julian's voice broke. She said you had more money than you needed, that you were wasting it on foolish dreams while we were struggling with the mortgage on this house, that she was just borrowing it and planned to pay it back eventually. She said you'd never have noticed if you hadn't gotten obsessed with going to Paris. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. And the campaign to have me declared incompetent? The psychiatrist evaluation? She said that was for your own good, that you clearly weren't thinking rationally if you wanted to travel at your age, that someone needed to take control before you hurt yourself or got scammed by someone worse than her. He laughed bitterly. She actually said someone worse than her, like she was doing you a favor by only stealing a few $1,000s. What happens now? I asked. I told her to pack a bag and leave, tonight. She's going to stay at a hotel while we figure out divorce proceedings. And Mom? He took a shaky breath. She's going to return every penny she took. I'm making sure of it. I have documentation of what she admitted to, and I told her if she doesn't return the money within 48 hours, I'll support you in pressing criminal charges. Julian! No, Mom.
This is not negotiable. She stole from you. She tried to have you declared incompetent to cover her crime. She deserves to face consequences. And the only reason I'm giving her the option to return the money first is because I can't stand the thought of my wife going to prison, even though I know she deserves it. I'm not strong enough for that. But I can make sure you get your money back. I can do that much. I felt tears streaming down my face. I'm proud of you, I said. I know this is horrible and painful, and I'm so sorry. Don't apologize, he said firmly. None of this is your fault. Mom, I should have believed you from the start. I should have trusted your judgment instead of letting her convince me you were losing your grip on reality. That's on me. We talked for another hour, making plans, discussing next steps. Julian would oversee the return of the funds. He had already contacted a divorce attorney. He was moving forward with ending his marriage, and while I felt sad for him, I also felt relief that he was finally seeing clearly. The next afternoon, I received a bank notification on my phone. A deposit had been made to my savings account, $3,500, with a memo line that simply read, "Repayment." I sat in my living room and stared at that notification for a long time. My Paris fund was whole again. More than whole, actually, because I still had the original amount I'd saved minus the tour deposit. But more important than the money was what it represented. Vindication, justice, the proof that I'd been right to trust my instincts and fight back. That evening, Julian came by with more news. She's leaving Millbrook Springs. Her company is transferring her to the Atlanta office. She says she can't stay here after this. Everyone will know what she did. Will they? Asked. Know what she did? Julian looked at me seriously. Do you want them to? I'll support whatever you decide, Mom. If you want to press charges, make this public, I'll stand beside you. But if you want to handle it privately and just move on, I'll respect that too. I thought about it carefully. Part of me wanted Vivienne exposed, wanted everyone to know what she had done. But another part of me just wanted to reclaim my life and move forward. I want people to know enough to protect themselves, I said finally. I'm going to tell my friends what happened, not for gossip, but so they can watch for similar warning signs with their own families. And I want it on record with the police, even if I don't press charges. So there's a paper trail if she tries this with someone else. But I don't need a public trial or news coverage. I just need my life back. Julian nodded. That seems fair, wise even. He paused. The divorce will be finalized in a few months. The house will have to be sold. We can't afford it on just my income, and I don't want to anyway. Too many bad memories now. I'm going to look for something smaller, simpler, maybe closer to you. I'd like that, I said softly. Over the next few weeks, things slowly settled into a new normal. Vivienne left town without any further contact. Julian moved into a temporary apartment while the house sale was processed, and I continued my preparations for Paris, which was now only 6 weeks away. My quilting circle threw me a bon voyage party, celebrating both my upcoming trip and my victory over Vivienne's scheme. Dorothy made a toast. To Eleanor, who proved that 70 is not too old for adventure, for fighting back, or for teaching entitled thieves a lesson they won't forget. We laughed and ate cake, and I felt more supported and loved than I had in years. Mrs. Chen at the library had been equally supportive. She said, I knew something was wrong. The way Vivienne talked about you, it never matched the woman I saw every day. I'm glad you trusted yourself enough to dig deeper.
Detective Reeves had also been pleased when I'd updated her. You did everything right, she'd said. You gathered evidence, you protected yourself, and you achieved justice without needing the criminal system. That's actually the best outcome in many of these cases. And having it on record means if she tries this again somewhere else, there's a history. As March 15th approached, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness that had nothing to do with worries about my capability to travel. I was simply about to achieve a lifelong dream, and the weight of that was almost overwhelming. The night before my flight, Julian came over with a gift bag. I wanted to give you this before you left, he said, looking almost shy. Inside was a beautiful leather journal, the kind with thick, creamy pages perfect for writing. On the first page, Julian had written, "For Mom's Paris adventure. May this trip be everything you've dreamed of and more. Love, Julian. P.S. Dad and Sandra would be so proud of you." I'd hugged him tight, both of us crying a little. "Thank you for believing me," I'd whispered. "Thank you for choosing to see the truth." "Thank you for being stubborn enough to fight for yourself," he'd replied, "and for teaching me what real strength looks like." The next morning, I boarded a plane for the first time in my life. The flight attendants were kind and helpful. My seatmate was a lovely woman named Patricia, who was also on the Heritage Tourist trip, and the whole experience was nowhere near as frightening as Vivienne had tried to make me believe it would be. Paris was everything I dreamed and more. The Eiffel Tower took my breath away. The Louvre was overwhelming in the best possible way. The sidewalk cafes, the architecture, the way the light hit the Seine River at sunset, it was all exactly as magical as that 18-year-old girl watching Audrey Hepburn had imagined. I wrote in my journal every evening, documenting not just the sights, but the feelings. The pride of having made this happen for myself, the joy of proving wrong everyone who'd said I was too old, the bittersweet awareness that Thomas and Sandra couldn't be here, but the certainty that they were with me in spirit. On my 5th day in Paris, I was sitting at a cafe in Montmartre, sipping coffee and watching artists paint the street scene, when I decided to send that postcard. I'd bought a stack of them, touristy cards featuring the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, Notre Dame. I'd already sent them to Julian, to my quilting circle friends, to Mrs. Chen, but I had one more to send. I addressed it to Vivienne, in care of her new apartment in Atlanta. Julian had mentioned the address in passing, probably not thinking I'd use it. On the back of the postcard, a beautiful shot of the Eiffel Tower lit up at night, I wrote, "Dear Vivienne, greetings from Paris. The city is absolutely wonderful. Everything I dreamed it would be. I'm having no trouble navigating, managing my schedule, or handling my finances. In fact, I feel more capable and alive than I have in years. Thank you for trying to stop me from coming here. Your theft and manipulation made me look closely at my life and realize I needed to trust myself more than I trusted people who claimed to know what was best for me. In a strange way, you gave me a gift. You showed me I'm far stronger than even I believed. I hope Atlanta is treating you well. I hope you've learned something from this experience. But mostly, I hope you never try to do to anyone else what you did to me. I'm not too old to travel. I'm not too old to dream, and I'm definitely not too old to stand up for myself. Warmly, Eleanor." I dropped it in a mailbox near the cafe and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. That chapter was closed. This was my new beginning. The rest of the trip was pure magic. I made friends with the other travelers in my group. Patricia, whom I'd sat next to on the plane, became a particular friend. She was 73, had recently lost her husband, and was on her first solo trip. We bonded over late-night conversations in hotel lobbies about grief, resilience, and the courage it takes to build a new life after loss. "My kids think I'm crazy," she'd confided one evening. "They wanted me to move in with one of them, let them take care of me, but I'm not ready to be taken care of. I'm ready to live." "Me too," I said, raising my glass of wine in a toast. "To living, not just existing. To being too old for all the best adventures," she added with a grin. When I returned home 2 weeks later, Julian picked me up at the airport. He looked lighter somehow, unburdened by the weight of his failed marriage and the guilt of not seeing what was happening. "How was it?" he asked as we drove back to Millbrook Springs. "Perfect," I said simply. Every single moment was perfect. At home, I found my apartment exactly as I had left it, but it felt different now. Not like a small box where I had been told to stay, but like a cozy home base for a life full of possibilities. Over the next few weeks, I settled back into my routines, but with a new energy. I started planning my next trip. Patricia and I had talked about going to Ireland next year. I took on more hours at the library because I wanted to, not because I needed to. I continued making quilts, but now I raised my prices because I'd realized my work was worth more than I'd been charging.
And I started teaching a class at the senior center, not in age-appropriate activities, as Vivienne had once condescendingly suggested, but in financial literacy and fraud prevention for elderly people. I shared my story, taught people how to protect themselves, and created a support network for others who'd experienced similar manipulation by family members.
The class became so popular that Detective Reeves asked me to present at a community safety forum. My story reached people beyond Millbrook Springs. I received letters from elderly people who'd recognized warning signs in their own lives because of my presentation. 3 people reported financial abuse by family members after hearing me speak. I was making a difference. At 70 years old, after being told I was too old to travel, too incompetent to manage my own affairs, too much of a liability to be trusted, I was making a real difference in the world. 6 months after my Paris trip, Julian's divorce was finalized. He bought a modest house only 10 minutes from my apartment, and we rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully. He understood now what he'd failed to see before, that respecting someone isn't about controlling them or protecting them from themselves. It's about trusting them to know their own minds and supporting them in their choices. One evening, as we sat on his new patio eating takeout pizza and watching the sunset, he said, "Mom, I have a confession." I looked at him curiously. "What's that?" "I always thought, secretly, that Dad was wrong to make you promise to go to Paris. I thought he was being selfish, asking you to spend money on a trip when you had so little. I thought you should be practical, save everything for emergencies, for security." He paused. But he was right. He knew you needed something to live for, not just something to survive on, and he trusted you to know what that was. "Your father was a wise man," I said softly. "So are you, Mom. You're the wisest person I know." A year after my Paris trip, I was sitting in my apartment planning my Ireland adventure with Patricia when I received an unexpected letter. The return address was from Atlanta, and for a moment my heart raced, thinking it might be from Vivienne. But when I opened it, I found something else entirely. It was from a lawyer representing someone named Margaret Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen at my library, an elderly woman in Atlanta who Vivienne had apparently befriended and begun manipulating in a pattern eerily similar to what she'd done to me. The lawyer had found my name through the police report I had filed, and Margaret was building a case against Vivienne for financial exploitation. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify about my experience to establish a pattern of behavior. I called Detective Reeves immediately. "This is good news," she said, after I explained. "A pattern of behavior is much harder to defend against than a single incident. If you're willing to testify, it could help this woman get justice." "Of course I'm willing," I said without hesitation. "If I can help stop Vivienne from doing this to anyone else, I absolutely will." The trial took place 8 months later. I flew to Atlanta, another plane trip that proved once again that I was perfectly capable of travel, and testified about what Vivienne had done to me, about the stolen money, the manipulation, the attempt to have me declared incompetent. Margaret Chen testified too, telling a heartbreaking story of how Vivienne had befriended her at a church social, gradually gained her trust and access to her finances, and stolen nearly $15,000 before Margaret's granddaughter noticed suspicious transactions and investigated. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts of financial exploitation of the elderly. Vivienne was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to both Margaret and me. She was also placed on a registry that would flag her if she ever tried to work in positions with access to vulnerable populations again. When I sat in that courtroom watching the sentence handed down, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that justice had been served, sadness for Julian, who'd loved someone capable of such calculated cruelty.
But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd trusted my instincts, grateful that I'd fought back, grateful that my stubbornness about going to Paris exposed Vivienne's crimes before she could do even more damage. After the trial, Margaret Chen took me to lunch. We were both in our 70s, both widows, both survivors of the same predator. "Thank you," she said simply. "If you hadn't filed that police report, if you hadn't been willing to testify, I don't think I would have had the courage to pursue this. I was so ashamed that I'd been fooled. We weren't fooled because we were stupid or incompetent. We were betrayed by someone who deliberately manipulated us. There's a difference." She nodded, tears in her eyes. My granddaughter said the same thing. She said the fact that we trusted people was a good quality, not a weakness. She's absolutely right, I agreed. And the fact that we fought back when we realized what was happening? That's strength. We exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. 2 more members of an unofficial club none of us wanted to join, but grateful to have found each other nonetheless. Now, 2 years after that fateful afternoon when Vivienne told me I was too old to travel, I'm sitting in my apartment looking at photos from my recent trip to Ireland with Patricia. We had an absolutely wonderful time exploring Dublin, kissing the Blarney Stone, and staying in a castle that had been converted into a hotel. Next year, we're thinking about Croatia, or maybe Greece. We're still deciding, but we have time. We have all the time in the world, and we're not too old for any of it.
My financial literacy and fraud prevention class continues to grow. We meet twice a month at the senior center, and the room is always full. I've helped 17 people identify and stop financial exploitation by family members or caregivers. 17 people who might otherwise have lost their savings, their independence, their dignity. The quilts I make now are more expensive. I charge what they're worth, what my time and skill deserve. And I donate a portion of the proceeds to elder justice organizations that fight financial abuse. My Paris guidebook still sits on my coffee table, but now it's surrounded by guidebooks for Ireland, Croatia, Greece, and Japan. Patricia and I are ambitious in our planning. Mrs. Chen at the library retired last year, and they offered me the head librarian position. I turned it down, not because I couldn't do it, but because I didn't want to. I like my part-time hours. They give me flexibility for travel, for my classes, for living a life that's about more than just work. People sometimes ask me if I regret how everything happened, if I wish I'd never discovered Vivienne's theft, if I wish my relationship with Julian hadn't gone through such turmoil. My answer is always the same: no, because Vivienne's cruelty forced me to look closely at my life and realize I'd been making myself small, accepting less than I deserved, letting other people define what was appropriate or possible for me. She told me I was too old to travel. In trying to stop me, she gave me the motivation to prove exactly how capable I really was. And in the process, I found not just Paris, but myself. I'm 72 now. I'm planning my 4th international trip. I'm teaching people to protect themselves from predators. I have a strong relationship with my son built on mutual respect. I have friends who celebrate my adventures rather than trying to limit them. And every time I look at those postcards from Paris on my refrigerator, the ones I kept for myself, I remember the most important lesson I learned. You're never too old to fight for yourself. You're never too old to trust your instincts. You're never too old to live the life you've dreamed of, no matter who tries to tell you otherwise. I was told to stay home where I belonged. Instead, I discovered that I belonged in the world, on my own terms, living fully until my very last breath. And that postcard I sent to Vivienne from Paris, Julian told me months later that she'd kept it, that it was found among her belongings when she was arrested. Apparently, she'd looked at it often, a reminder of the woman who'd refused to be broken, who'd exposed her crimes,
who'd proven that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all. I'm glad she kept it. I hope every time she looked at that Eiffel Tower glowing against the night sky, she remembered that she didn't win, that her victim wasn't a victim at all, but a survivor who became a fighter. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 72 years old. I'm too old for nothing that matters. And my next adventure is already being planned.